and welcome to The Black Unconscious,
a mental health podcast about living, coping, and thriving while Black.
I'm Raquel Martin, a PhD candidate in medical and clinical psychology.
And I'm Dr. Justin Hopkins, a licensed clinical psychologist.
This podcast is not meant to be a substitute for a therapeutic relationship with a licensed therapist.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey, and welcome to The Black Unconscious. We are your hosts. I am Dr. Justin Hopkins.
And I am Raquel Martin.
And today is episode 10, entitled Faith Without Work is Dead, Spirituality and Mental Health.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about the integration of spirituality and religiosity. I don't know if that's a word. With mental health and its impact on African Americans.
Yes, and religiosity is a word, and we're going to be using it today. I do want to say, if you're not a spiritual or religious person, if you are either agnostic or atheist, I still think there are things that you can get from this episode. But I will say that we are going to be focusing more on Christian Black church culture. The Black church plays a huge role in African American life and community. And so we want to explore that a little bit more and understand how religiosity and spirituality contributes to our mental health, how it influences our mental health, and things of that nature. So why don't we get right into it? I think the first thing I really want to highlight is that there's a lot of research on religiosity, spirituality, and how it benefits our mental health. You know, for example, there's been a number of studies that have showed that religiosity is a buffer for suicide. It's negatively correlated with suicide. People who are more religious and more spiritual are more likely to believe that suicide is not morally sound.
That's well known within the mental health community because when we do suicide assessments, we look for risk factors, which are like lack of social support, lack of ability to, state a reason to live. If you've had a previous attempt, that's a big indicator if you're going to make the next attempt. And a protective factor is a reason to live. And for a lot of individuals, the reason to live would be, there's another way to say it. I feel like I heard multiple times growing up that if you kill yourself, you're going to hell. There's that. But there's also
Right.
just the thought of there being a higher power and that you can work through it without having to harm yourself. Like praying about it would help you, or being able to go to church would be able to help you, or going to choir practice, or just the support system of being in the church would help you as a protective factor.
Absolutely. And also that belief in the higher power, as you mentioned, right? That this idea that, for example, some religious persons often believe that everything happens for a reason, that there's a higher power that is in charge of the situation, and that there are that life can be ordered out in a way that it ultimately ends up in their favor. And so optimism is often correlated with religiosity. Even studies have even showed that religious countries have lower rates of suicide and depression, and actually there's also been studies that suggest that those who believe suicide is acceptable. So as you mentioned, like in the Christian faith, like suicide is not looked at as acceptable. And in a lot of other faiths as well, suicide is not an acceptable act. And so when those who believe suicide is acceptable are actually 12.7 times more likely to make plans to kill themselves.
Yeah, I think it's also important to talk about the difference between religious and spiritual, right? Because I think a lot of the studies talked about being religious, but they also miss out on the aspect of being spiritual, because to me, being spiritual is believing in a higher power, versus being religious is belonging to an established religious order. So you can be spiritual, and that would also be a protective factor for some individuals, other than other than being religious. Because I do think they're different. Like religion is an organized order. It's a certain faith. You could be Christian,
certain sacraments and traditions and rituals, and just coveted practices with meaning and a lot of significance to the faith.
Yeah, because you can be spiritual and not subscribe to any specific religion.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, so Black folks are notorious for being religious and also being spiritual, and our spirituality and religiosity matters quite a bit to us if you are one of those Black persons that do actually ascribe to that. So I think it begs the question of how did that come to be? How did that happen? And there is a historical context as to why there are really high rates of religiosity and spirituality among Black folks. And it does go back to our genesis in this country and how we kind of gravitated specifically towards Christianity as a message of hope and a message of divine purpose when we were just chattel and property, when we were slaves. You know, during that time, because there was such a dearth of positivity or a dearth of things that were hopeful or enlightening, there was very little for us to hold on to. And so our spirituality in so many ways was all that we had to kind of look for. Perhaps life after bondage, to the idea of heaven in particular, I think was incredibly useful, to think that even though we're in bondage and we're enslaved here and that we have no freedom, we have no rights, that we're treated like property, there is a life after our life here that will allow us to live in our fullest and appreciate and experience joy and happiness and freedom. And without that belief, I mean, I don't think I think it's so much harder to muster a sense of hope and purpose and a reason for living. And so I think religion and spirituality played a really, really important role during slavery. Go ahead.
It's also just the big aspect that the church used to be all that we have. Like, it was the only time when white people were able to congregate, and for so long the church was a way to get so many different resources. Like, if one of the children in the area were going to college, it was the church where they were able to raise money to send that one person off to college. Like, it was basically informal social services. They provided food, they provided shelter, they provided clothing, they provided support. Like, so if you're so used to having one area where everything is provided for you, like, this is all we have, this is the one avenue that we have, I can understand why it seems so odd and so foreign for older generations and therefore younger generations, because it gets passed down transgenerationally, to go out of that one avenue that we had for us, the one avenue where we could trust each other, to go out of that. And not only go out of that, but go to medical professionals, and then go to medical professionals who you most of the time don't get to see people who look like you. So the root of it makes so much sense, because before we were able to be trained accurately in mental health and go to school, you learned to read in the church, and you learned about like heaven in the church, and you made your best friend in the church, and you met like your future spouse in the church, and you were given shelter. Like, if you didn't have somewhere to live, you slept in the church. They did clothing drives. They provided you with everything that you needed. So just to go out of that is kind of goes to the sense of what we said before. I think the first episode about like house business stays in the house. It's like, why would you want to go out to talk to those people when we aren't even sure they're individuals who will fully understand you?
And I think back then it was like all business stays within the church. Like you said, you go there for recreation, you go there for worship, you go there for prayer, you go there to build relationships, you go there to raise your family, to nurture your values. So you literally everything was there. And I think to that end, right, there's so many other places outside that were dangerous, so many other institutions that were racist, biased, and mistreated us. And we've talked about the history of mental health and medical care in this on this podcast before. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the other thing is that there were the message of equality is really essential in the Christian faith. I think in all faiths, really, this idea that all spiritual persons are the child of God, are equal under God's eyes. All human life is valued to the same degree, and so as an oppressed person, as a slave, that idea obviously ran counter to their enslavement, to our enslavement. It spoke a message of humanization, of freedom, of value, and those were things that I think were incredibly important and remain important. And but especially you can imagine like during that time would be all the more important. I think one of the unfortunate things though is that despite like all the benefits of spirituality and religiosity, how they can help us to cope, how it can give us a sense of hope and optimism, and give us a sense of purpose and meaning for our life, that there are times when, and Raquel, you were just kind of mentioning this, when there's certain, I think we're doing a better job of this now, but there are a large number, I think, still of Black churches that kind of pit mental health and spirituality against one another. And that's tough.
It's also tough when the church is spouting, or individuals within the church, because I don't want to say the church because different pastors do different things, but when the church is spouting something that's in the antithesis of who you are, like I've straight been up at a church and they mentioned something against someone who wasn't heterosexual, which is absurd, in my opinion. Because if we are dealing with an environment where the only person who can judge is God, and we're supposed to love thy neighbor, it's kind of opposite. It doesn't make any sense. It's a paradox to love thy neighbor, but ... only if they're heterosexuals, right? So it's concerning to individuals. It can be a struggle and inner turmoil to have grown up in the church and have had such a connection to it, and then when you grow up and you may identify a different way, you feel like the church has just turned its back on you. But this is something that you can have a huge struggle with because you grew up that way and that's your support system. So you either have to sublimate who you are as a person, or be who you are and be out and then risk the backlash. So I think that can be really detrimental to mental health, especially given when it comes to males and females, but specifically males within the Black community, and the aspect of your masculinity and what that looks like for you, and also in terms of toxic masculinity within the Black environment and Black males, and how that may contribute to you feeling even more hopeless when it comes to coming out. So you think
I see when it comes to a gay person living their true identity.
Yeah.
I see. And so you're saying that churches kind of inadvertently contribute to toxic masculinity for gay men by when they say things that are anti-LGBTQ.
Yeah, and contributing to the mental health disorders as a result, because individuals who are lesbian, gay, transgender, they have mental health disorders like 2 or 3 times fold more than we do. So it's even worse, especially the transgender community.
Yes.
They have the highest rate of any mental health disorder. Right. It's staggering the rates.
Well, they're also one of the most like misunderstood, I think, within that community.
Yeah, they're the most misunderstood, and I think they're the most oppressed. That people don't want to listen to. So they're also oppressed. Right. So I can only imagine the inner turmoil that comes from, I grew up, I used to wear my little, white patent leather shoes and those annoying behind frilly socks and stuff like that. And then I grow up and it's like, oh, well, maybe this isn't who I am.